So there's a YouTuber who mocks and makes fun of, other YouTubers who don't fall in line with the narrative that humans are causing the planet to heat up. Imagine the irony of that. All of you YouTubers who question climate change, you're a bunch of morons, but me, I'm also a YouTuber, but I'm right. And just think about how scientific it is to mock skeptics. This guy has a degree in engineering physics, yet apparently never learned that science is never settled, especially when dealing with something as complex as the question of anthropogenic global warming. This guy is anti-science. And yet he's got almost 6 million views for this video, which doesn't surprise me because YouTube and Google, they shadow ban content that doesn't reinforce the narrative. If you do, in fact, you do a Google search specifically for climate change skepticism. I did a recent search, top 4 results, all alarmist websites that reinforce the narrative.
We own the science.
And one has to wonder, is this how Derek over at Veritasium did his research? Did he use Google? Did he read Wikipedia propaganda? It sure appears that way because all he does is recite alarmist propaganda, as we'll review shortly. But anyway, if he can mock other YouTubers, then certainly I can critique him. And I can just hear somebody say, but you're just a YouTuber, you're not a scientist. And that's actually my point. You don't have to be a scientist to figure out that anthropogenic global warming is a load of nonsense that has spun out of control. You just need common sense. So in this video, if there's one thing that climate change pushers love to do is to get you all lost in the minutia in order to distract you away from the big elephant in the room. This is how you win debates. You get people sidetracked, distracted, diverted by red herrings. And that's most of what he does in this video. But what's completely remiss in this video is the big elephant in the room, the cold, hard fact that we humans have only added 1.4 parts CO2 to 10,000 parts atmosphere since we began measuring 150 odd years ago. That's it. When you see this stat, anyone with an ounce of common sense will stop and say, wait a minute. There's no way that this teeny tiny amount of CO2 is causing the planet to heat up. I don't care what all these government paid scientists say. This doesn't pass the common sense test. And you don't have to be a scientist to observe this. All you need is, again, common sense. But CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It gets amplified. Yeah, but it's still teeny tiny. We're still dealing with teeny tiny. This is the little flea in the room. How much is 1.4 parts out of 10,000 worth in terms of warming? Oh, what's this? I did a video about this. Shadow ban, of course. It's worth about 1.71 thousandths of a degree. This should be right up Derek's alley. He's a math guy. Can he not observe teeny tiny and then contemplate that teeny tiny can't do anything major? I think this guy is brainwashed by all the propaganda. And we saw this with COVID. Scientists, doctors, medical experts who were completely wrong about everything. But the difference between COVID and climate change, unfortunately, is that it may take 150 years before we can finally fact check the global warming nuts. Or we may never get to. We might head into another mini ice age after we switch to mostly green energy, and they'll declare that we did it. We fixed the weather.
Let's talk about the science of climate change.
The science. These alarmists always claim to have the science on their side.
We own the science.
Well, the overall average temperature of the planet is increasing.
No, believe it or not, despite all of the propaganda that you may have heard, this is in dispute. Due to just margin of error, the average temperature of the planet may not have increased at all. Also, claims of rapid increase have been challenged by people like Dr. Roy Spencer as being exaggerated by as much as 50%. Also, even if you choose to believe that the planet has been warming to some degree or another, a scientist should know the most basic rule that says that correlation does not prove causation. And in the case of global warming, we can't even begin to have a correlation in the first place because 1.4 parts per 10,000 is so tiny. How does next to nothing cause something big?
But that doesn't mean it's going to be warmer everywhere all the time. And that leads to some confusion. Like on a cold winter's day, you might say, so much for global warming. Exactly.
Yeah, and if we flip this around, it also doesn't mean that whenever there's a localized heat wave or some record temperature in some city, that it's because the global temperature is increasing.
The globe's not warming. Since when? 1995. That's not how you draw a trend line through data. If the slope is nil, the climate's chill. You know, 13 of the 14 hottest years occurred this century.
So who's gathering, massaging, and homogenizing this recorded data? See, he's assuming that the data hasn't been fraudulently manipulated or isn't contaminated due to things like urban heat island effect. There's an article in Forbes magazine about this, link in the description. Also, global temperature data, whether compiled by alarmists or skeptics, tends to move incrementally, so you don't have wild deviations. So if you're in an uptrend, for example, coming out of the Little Ice Age, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for 13 out of 14 years to be up years. Also, thermometer data only goes back to 1880 or something like that, which is a blink of an eye in geological terms. Satellite data only goes back to about 1980. And again, most importantly, correlation is not causation. We could simply be coming out of the Little Ice Age.
Oh, so now you say it's warming. In the past, scientists told us it was cooling. Why can't they just admit that they have no idea what's going on? It's true, in the 1970s there were some papers published predicting cooling. But over that same time period, there were 6 times as many papers predicting warming. So scientists really haven't changed their tune.
First of all, I don't know if this study is legitimate. This is another thing that alarmists do. They figure out creative ways to cherry pick papers or cherry pick scientist opinions. Joseph Bass did a presentation showing how they doctored up these studies that claim that 97% of scientists all agree that humans are causing the planet to warm. And most importantly, science is not settled by consensus of scientists. Remember the space shuttle disaster? There was a consensus of NASA scientists who all said that a piece of foam falling off the booster tank couldn't damage the space shuttle on takeoff. And there was only like one guy who was saying otherwise.
The Earth is cooling. But you don't just have to go by the temperatures. There are plenty of other signs that the globe is warming. Like sea levels are rising 3 millimeters a year.
I wonder what the margin of error is on that. But correlation is not causation. Earth has always gone through changes. You know, most of the Alps were ice-free 6,000 years ago. Only about 20,000 years ago, New York sat under a mile-thick glacier.
That's an indication that the oceans are getting warmer and so expanding. Ice on Antarctica and Greenland is melting at unprecedented rates.
Unprecedented rates. Well, that declaration ended badly because we fast forward to 2022 and scientists now say that the ice has recovered and the previous loss was, of course, natural. But this underscores how you can't rush to judgment based on just, 10 or 20 years of data. That's a blink of an eye in geological terms. What were sea levels at 200, 500, 1,000 years ago? We don't know. Also, where is he getting this data about Antarctica from that he cites as the gospel? Because according to even NASA data, the Antarctic ice sheet is growing.
Arctic sea ice increased 40% in the last 2 years. That last little uptick? That's what you focus on? What about the general downward trend?
This NASA study came out the very same year that he released this video. It wouldn't surprise me if Google shadow banned this NASA study, and so he's just unaware of it.
You know, if the Earth is warming, the most likely source of the problem is the sun. The sun is getting brighter. Did you ever think of that? The sun was getting brighter in the 1930s. And it probably contributed to some warming then, but since the 50s, the sun has been getting dimmer and temperatures continue to rise.
Temperature no longer agrees with the sun if you trust that the temperature data hasn't been fudged upward. But if we use Tim Ball's climate chart, maybe the sun is the main driver of temperature.
Oh, so you automatically assume it's man-made CO2. You know, humans only emit a tiny fraction of the CO2 released into the atmosphere every year. That's true. People emit about 30 gigatons, compared with 780 gigatons from natural land and ocean processes. So you admit it, humans aren't the problem. No. Before us, the system was in balance, with the land and oceans absorbing that same amount, 780 gigatons a year.
So this is another one of these fantastic claims that doesn't pass the smell test, the common sense test. He's conveniently trying to suggest that 780 gigatons just happens to be the ocean's magic number, the tipping point. The ocean can absorb no more, and from that point onward, it just gets stuck in the atmosphere. This is a cell.
This balance kept carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere between 180 and 280 parts per million for 800,000 years. Now it's at 400 parts per million and still rising.
Again, convert that to parts per 10,000, and at the time of this video is 1.2 parts per 10,000.
But our small contribution couldn't have caused that.
Exactly.
Well, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing by about 15 gigatons, or 2 parts per million, every year.
Yeah, teeny tiny.
But volcanoes emit way more CO2 than humans.
All right, this is just more straw man talk. I'm going to skip ahead.
Water in the atmosphere is increasing as well.
Okay, what he failed to mention in this straw man argument is that warmer temperatures, if there is any, causes water vapors to condense into clouds, which in turn reflect sunlight, thus reducing warming. And this study out of Finland, which he's probably unaware of, says that because of low cloud cover, human activity can account for no more than a 0.01% Celsius rise in global temperatures.
The only way for the atmosphere to hold more water vapor is if it gets warmer.
So this is just more circular reasoning. If, in fact, it's getting warmer, why is that? He's assuming that it's due to humans and not from just coming out of the Little Ice Age.
It all comes back to CO2. A doubling of CO2 on its own would increase the temperature of the globe by about 1 degree Celsius.
Whoa! He just made this blanket statement as if it's fact. We don't know that. He never qualified this statement. Where's the laboratory experiment that shows this?
A doubling of CO2 on its own would increase the temperature of the globe by about 1 degree Celsius.
This is made up. This is some alarmist scientist's unproven assumption.
We own the science.
A doubling of CO2.
And notice how he says doubling. This is a form of line with statistics. You say doubling instead of saying 1.4 parts per 10,000.
So it's a positive feedback loop, which a bunch of different sources of evidence all indicate will lead to about a 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature.
Translation, he's regurgitating the opinions of a bunch of different cherry-picked government-paid alarmists.
But if this is true, why have all the predictions failed? In actuality, most of the predictions show remarkable agreement with observations. But you're probably thinking of the model from 1988, back when we thought climate sensitivity was higher. If you rerun that model with 3 degrees of warming for every doubling of CO2, the predictions match exactly the warming that we've observed.
So he's trying to gaslight people on all these failed predictions. So many have come from high-profile sources like the United Nations, and it's just been a publicity nightmare. And so somebody probably doctored up another study to do damage control. I already talked about how Joseph Bast exposed how these alarmists have so many creative ways to cherry-pick papers or cherry-pick opinions to produce studies that support their narratives. Anyway, the rest of this video, a lot of it is more minutia and getting you distracted and sidetracked. I'm going to skip ahead here.
And my point is, it would be better for all species on this planet and probably cheaper for us if we just started reducing emissions now than if we wait and pay the consequences later.
So again, this is circular reasoning. He's assuming that CO2 warming is real. And now the physicist is now assuming the role of economist, telling us that spending trillions of dollars to fight an unproven theory is a good thing economically. That would destroy us.
This week I wanted to recommend the book
Merchants of Doubt, which is about scientists who have spread misinformation about certain topics.
Speaking of people who spread misinformation about certain topics, notice the author of this book, Naomi Oreskes, known as the socialist historian, is none other than one of the people that Joseph Bast exposed as producing a bogus study to bolster the narrative that there's this supposed consensus on global warming, that scientists agree that humans are causing the planet to warm. No, don't read this book. Instead, let me recommend you a better book, How to Lie with Statistics, so that you can learn how these merchants of propaganda lie. Or better yet, just read the Cliff Notes, link in the description.